Welcome to class. This is a course on political ideas. This is Introduction to Political Ideas. My name is Ken Hicks. Let's jump in. We've been talking about just what ideology is and how we can go about defining it, and the role that ideologies play in kind of influencing action, conditioning the way we look at things. Today we're going to talk a little bit about what I consider to be kind of modifiers of ideology, and it's nationalism and anarchism. These are two very powerful forces in sort of how people think about things. They're not really ideologies in their own right. They're more like modifiers, if you will, that don't really, there are a lot of people out there that may be nationalists, they may be left-wing nationalists, they may be right-wing nationalists. It's hard really to tell. Then we're going to address an essay by a guy named Terrell Carver, who looks at the evolution of the concept of ideology and why we have such kind of varying ideas about it. And then I'm going to conclude with a discussion of an article by a neuroscientist who basically posits that our brain chemistry affects how we behave in terms of ideology. So first of all, let's start talking about nationalism and anarchism. These are two, again, kind of emotional sentiments or approaches to politics that kind of fit within the gaps of the definition of ideology that we've been talking about, which again is this idea that ideologies present a coherent set of ideas that define reality, describe reality, evaluate reality, orient people, and provide a program for action. Anarchism and nationalism both do some of those things, but not necessarily all of them. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about nationalism. Nationalism is a compound term from the Latin natus, or birth. It is, again, a powerful kind of rival force to ideology in modern politics. What were the factors that kind of led to the emergence of nationalism? It's important to keep in mind that, for certainly the ancient world and for a good period of the medieval world, there were really only two forms of government, and that was city-states and empires. And you really didn't see kind of governments forming around nations. And we'll talk a little bit about what it means to be a nation versus a state. What began to change that? Well, first of all, going all the way back to the 16th century, you have the emergence of these rivalries that began to lead, kind of monastic rivalries, the Habsburgs in Austria, in the Austrian Empire, and Spain. And then you had the emergence of kind of the first full-blown nation state in the United Kingdom, in England. And the pattern set by England was that war, and the threat of invasions by the Vikings and other groups of people really compelled the formation of what we would consider to be an administrative state, which is to say what? You have the ability, there is a central force that has the ability to tell people what to do. Right, really beginning with Alfred the Great. They began recognizing that isolated outposts simply are too vulnerable to attack. They began centralizing people in towns. They began taxing people so that they could build fortifications around those towns to better protect them. They built a navy so that they could interdict foreign invaders. The importance of the Navy for England in its national development can never be understated. And so other countries began kind of forming along those bases. And a lot of it had to do with their effectiveness in waging war. Spain, for example, in the early period of the nation state, in the 15th and 16th century, really excelled at warfare, in part because they had a lot of money, because of their explorations of the New World and their discovery of gold in the New World. but also because they innovated militarily. They understood how to integrate firearms into set piece battlefield strategies and tactics, and they basically dominated the landscape of the early national period. But France was not too far behind them. And so really, what comes to a head is with the French Revolution, which we'll talk more about later on, and just after the American Revolution. The French Revolution doesn't yield the kind of results that happened with the United States. And, the French Revolution was a thoroughgoing social revolution where they were attempting to uproot all those all those feudal institutions that had made France really kind of corrupt and ineffective. But what it ended up with was a dictatorship under Napoleon. And Napoleon, again, was a military innovator. He understood how to use artillery very effectively. He was a junior artillery officer early in the French Revolutionary period. And so France really, the great innovation and the thing that really created kind of national sentiment among French people was the Grande Armée, the fact that Napoleon relied heavily on a draft. I mean, it's one of Voltaire's, the French intellectual Voltaire's sardonic comments was that God favors the big battalions. And the thing that made France dominant in the battlefield from 1797 to 1815 was the levée en masse, the fact that they could replenish their ranks with draftees. Up to that point, most of the armies of Europe were highly professional, to some extent almost mercenary in nature. They weren't very large. And France was ultimately able to field armies of 500, 600, ultimately 800,000 men. Oftentimes with drafts from countries that they defeated. Certainly that was the army that went into Russia. And again, that army was defeated because it wasn't comprised entirely of Frenchmen and because Napoleon fundamentally miscalculated how long he could stay in Moscow. If he had left early, probably the invasion would have been inconclusive. His desire to crush the French ultimately led to his defeat. But in any event, you begin seeing these, the sense in which people began identifying with language groups, with culture, in a much more passionate sense than they had previously. This again reflected the sense in which parochialism is no longer the dominant way of looking at things, and people are begin to think of themselves as Frenchmen rather than simply Normans or Parisians or something like that. And so there is an important distinction to be made when we think about nationalism. We don't call countries just nations. We typically call them nation states for a reason. And part of the reason is that most nation states that are currently among the 180 or so separate governments recognized by the United Nations, they are not homogenous. They are not comprised of only one nation. They are typically comprised of multiple religious, ethnic, and a variety of different cultural groupings. So when you say that someone belongs to a nation, what you are basically saying is that they belong to a set of peoples that share history, that share traditions, cultural traditions and mores and ways of doing things. They generally share a religion. A nation state, on the other hand, is oftentimes, again, a much more complex affair as it comes to the collection of people that are comprising them. There are very few homogeneous nation states. Japan is a good example, and part of that again has to do with Japanese culture, with their long periods of isolationism, with their tendency to try and keep people out. When you think about nationalism, and nations that are not states, one that leaps to mind is Kurdistan. Kurdistan, if you look at the map, it occupies this very mountainous region in southeastern Turkey and in parts of Syria, Iraq, and Iran. Kurdish-speaking peoples are part of what we call the Western Iranic language group. Again, because it's very mountainous territory, Kurds had long periods of independence from any kind of central rule in the ancient and well into the modern period. They became part of the Ottoman Empire, again, somewhat unwillingly, and made moves towards independence following the collapse of the Ottoman Empire. In fact, England took over parts of the Ottoman Empire that would not be part of Turkey, and England basically promised to the Kurds land for their own state. Ultimately, however, that didn't work out, and what ended up happening was that Kurdistan became parts of these other countries. And part of the reason for that was that Turkey, the Ottoman Empire kind of recoalesced as Turkey, and Turkey basically would not allow Kurdish independence, because if you again look at that map, very nearly a third of Turkey, Turkey's geography, and quite a bit of its population would be comprised of what would be taken away from them in a greater Kurdistan. And so Turkey's, and this is often what happens with nationalist movements. Turkey's aspiration for national greatness, collided with Kurdistan's desire for independence. And so that has, gone a long way. There have also been independence movements in Syria and Iraq. Of course, in Iraq today, Kurdistan enjoys a considerable amount of autonomy. And they remain part of a federal government within Iraq. The Kurds tend to be among the people of the Levant. They tend to be fairly pro-American in many ways. But again, nationally, their aspirations have tended to founder on the needs of these other four countries. And so oftentimes Kurds seek independence and have been suppressed. It's very significant that one group within Turkey, it was known as the Kurdish Workers' Party, that they have actually agreed to disarm. They've agreed to stack arms and to give up their aspirations for independence. That is very significant, and it makes you wonder what forces are taking place in the other parts of the Kurdish regions that are causing them to make that kind of decision. Because for a very long time, they were a real thorn in the side of the Turkish government. Another good example of a nation that is not a state are the Basques. They are the last of sort of what we call the Paleo-European, the original ethnic groupings in Europe. They have a very distinctive language and culture. And again, because it's a very fairly mountainous region, they had a long history of at least relative independence. One of the things that again happened in the 20th century with the establishment of the fascist regime under Francisco Franco was that led to the emergence of a terrorist organization, Escude ta Askatasuna, which is more easily described by its acronym ETA, which is Basque Homeland and Liberty. And they had a history of terrorism in the service of Basque independence. It was highly factionalized. There were factions within ETA that embraced sort of far left ideological beliefs, which is not surprising that they would form in reaction against the fascist regime of the Falange party led by Francisco Franco. National independence was the consensus item among the Basques, but some did advocate distinctive ideological programs in the event of their independence. Some were pretty doctrinaire Marxist-Leninists, while others, like many Southern European socialists in Spain proper, in Italy, in Greece, were what we would commonly describe as anarcho-syndicalists. Who advocated worker-led revolutions through trade unions and sought to abolish capitalism and what they described as wage slavery. So for them, their end game was a society governed by labor unions rather than political parties and formal governments. So what's the problem with just considering nationalism as an ideology? There's two basic problems. Again, what is a nation? That's problem number one. And problem number two is the reality that, there are multi-ethnic states in many, parts of the world. And both World War I and World War II provoked these kind of surges of nationalism. And we've seen another surge of what we might characterize as white nationalism in both the United States and Europe, largely stemming from large flows of immigration. In the United States, it's mainly coming from Spanish-speaking people from Mexico and Central America. In Europe, it is increasingly the result of a large flow of out-migration from the Middle East, especially from Syria during its civil war, but also a large number of folks coming from Africa. And so, in the immediate aftermath of World War II, you saw again this tug of nationalism that ultimately led to the dissolution of several of what we would call the compound states of the Eastern Bloc. Obviously, the Soviet Union, which was really an empire, right? The Soviet Union was, to no small extent, a recrudesced version of the Tsarist empire. And when the Tsar collapsed, the Soviet Union, the communist regime led by the Bolsheviks, effectively conquered much of that territory that the Tsars had managed. And again, these are comprised of very separate ethnic groups that may have shared a common religion with the Russians, but were ethnically distinct. And owing to the depredations both of the Tsar and the Soviet Union, had a real sense of grievance towards Russia proper. The Ukrainians, for example, the Georgians, the Belarusians, the Chechens, the Armenians, the Baltic states of Estonia and Latvia and Lithuania. These countries were always felt like, the people of those countries always felt like they were under coercion by the Russian state. And so in the aftermath, over the course of the late 1980s, as the Soviet Union began to, kind of collapse, those countries very quickly separated. And that, again, was the result of people saying, at the end of World War I, Woodrow Wilson was talking about self-determination. We want self-determination for us. And so that really is what drove that. And in many instances, it does not model perfectly as an ideology. It's a bit more primordial, if you will, and a bit less rational. An important aspect of this idea of nationalism that the authors discuss is the idea of populism. And again, that's the view that ordinary people should govern themselves, and that they should be, the rules should be in the interests of the ordinary people of a country and not the elites. There are a number of historical manifestations of this in the United States. You had in the late 19th century the formation of the Populist Party, which was comprised mainly of Midwestern farmers and ranchers in a revolt against the banking and railroad interests that controlled both political or exerted an enormous amount of influence over both political parties in the late 19th century, which, after all, we oftentimes described as the age of the robber barons. Populism is oftentimes aligned with what we call illiberal democracy, which we'll talk about next week when we discuss democracy. It is oftentimes characterized as an express rejection of liberal democracy, which again, liberal democracy is this idea that we are organized around individual rights, that the law looks at people, not looks at individuals and their conduct rather than groups of people collectively. Populism has both left-wing and right-wing sort of manifestations. I think you can make the argument, that Bernie Sanders is a populist of the left. He basically says, my sympathies are with ordinary working Americans. At the same time, I think it is perfectly clear that Donald Trump, is riding a kind of right-wing populism. So, how can you tell that Donald Trump is a populist? Well, certainly, he makes the argument. I mean, when he says, I am your retribution, he is basically saying, you are aggrieved. You folks who vote for me are aggrieved. And you are aggrieved because these elites, of whom he is one, he is a child of privilege, I am going to be your savior. I will be your retribution, right? That's a clear kind of, expression of both populism, but also of the decidedly anti-elitist sentiment that drives both left-wing and right-wing populism. Let's talk about anarchism now. Now, there's a popular misconception that anarchism is simply chaos and confusion and misrule and all this other stuff. In the Greek etymology, it really is again a compound term, anarchos, which means no rule or no government. So an anarchist is someone who advocates the abolition of government, but that doesn't mean they don't believe in politics, right? Again, you have to recognize that anarchism is oftentimes the byproduct of the dilemma of power, which is that all governments engage in acts that are repugnant to us from a moral perspective. And anarchists believe that governments and the state generally are unnecessary evils. Okay? So again, the question arises, is anarchism a clear and distinct ideology? And I think, again, the best conclusion, or the right conclusion, is that anarchism is not so much an ideology as it is an ideological modifier. There are vast differences and disagreements among anarchists that overwhelm the one consensus item that they have, which is that they don't like the state. So anarchism is not really an ideology, but rather the point of intersection of several ideologies. And so, what you'll find as we work through the different ideologies is that there are people who I think, are in fact liberal anarchists. They're called libertarians. They are anarchists who don't want you to know that they're anarchists. So they've rebranded themselves as libertarians. They don't believe in the state. They want to do everything that they can do to defund and demobilize the state. But they don't want you to point to them when all the bad things start happening. There are also, as I mentioned, in my discussion about the Basque people, a large number of, not exclusively Southern European, but a large number of what we would call socialist anarchists. And these are, again, folks who believe that the quickest pathway to communism, to a truly classless, government-free society, would be to get rid of government. And there were a number of those types of folks that were rivals of Karl Marx. Karl Marx, we commonly view as the, kind of the most influential of the socialists of the 19th century. But there were a number of folks that, including people like Pierre Proudhon and what was his name, Blanqui, the French anarchist, that absolutely were rivals of Marx and that contested his view of socialism as effectively more likely to lead to tyranny, which I think was in many ways borne out. So ideologies play, again, an important role in the conflicts that are currently roiling politics in America and throughout the world. Think about how ideology, for example, has driven Russian dictators Vladimir Putin's decision to invade Ukraine. Some people have made the argument that there is a distinctive ideology driving him that they characterize as Putinism. What are the key elements of the worldview that informs Vladimir Putin? One would be a Russian ultranationalism. So again, that's kind of a modifier. A kind of reactionary nostalgia for the empires of Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union. In fact, many people have argued that the template that Putin is looking at is not Joseph Stalin, but rather Peter the Great. Third, centralization of power and the elimination of independent sources of information. He's clearly done that effectively. Fourth, the primacy of state interests over individual well-being. Obviously, he has been feeding tens of thousands of Russians into the Ukrainian wood chipper. Their battlefield losses are likely 3 to 4 times higher than Ukrainian losses. Because Ukraine understands they have a much smaller population, a much smaller pool of manpower from which to draw. They have to be very careful with their human capital, if you will. 5, a sense of grievance against the West. And finally, and there are actually some more that we could add, a cult of personality around the person of Vladimir Putin. As we move through this semester, we're going to think about how that particular kind of ideology, where we actually locate that. Putin oftentimes, speaks along all ends of the ideological spectrum. He was, in fact, a member of the Communist Party in the waning days of the Soviet Union. But he has also made rather explicit appeals to Eastern Orthodox, to mysticism, to the Church, of Russia, as again a basis for his support, for his governance. All right, so now we're going to move on to this other reading. It's a essay by Terrell Carver, which is it's called Ideology: The Career of a Concept. And again, that's the interesting thing about ideas and about ideologies. They're dynamic, and although a word may emerge that means one thing, it can evolve quite a bit. Again, in the conflicts that surround ideology and the political conflicts that emerge, words take on additional meaning. For example, and we'll learn this more in a couple of weeks when we start talking about liberalism. Liberalism originally simply meant being generous. It meant generous-minded. It meant somebody who was open-handed and fair. Over time, it came to mean a specific set of beliefs, primarily beliefs about individual rights and about the beliefs in limited government. Today in the United States, liberal has been converted into a dirty word. It is a pejorative term that denotes someone, of course, conservatives for a long time have simply conflated liberal with socialist. Trump just the other day was, talking about, Marxists and things like that. I don't think there are very many Marxists laying around these days, but, again, one of his deputies, Stephen Miller, called the DC protesters a bunch of old hippies, again attempting to to draw and evoke images of liberals as somehow other than American. So Terrell Carver is an American political theorist. He spent most of his career in England. I believe he's a naturalized citizen today. He's been at the University of Bristol since 1980. The word ideology, again, emerged in the French Revolution during that period and just before. There was a decisive shift in meanings of the term that were associated with how certain people used them. And he wants to talk about 4 specific people, actually a little bit more than that. First, the idea of Napoleon Bonaparte, how he, kind of used a certain group of French intellectuals to rise to power and then denounced them later. Talk about Karl Marx and how he perceived ideology. Friedrich Engels, his co-writer, who lived on for a number of years after Marx's death. And then finally, Vladimir Lenin. So there was a group of people in France, just in the period just before the French Revolution. They were known as the philosophes, and they were deeply steeped in the French Enlightenment. And in 1795, they established the Institute of France, the Institut de France. And they operated on a set of 3 assumptions. 1, that progress in social life is desirable. 2, that progress comes only from correct ideas. And 3, that incorrect ideas must be resisted, especially in the schools. Now this is sort of the doctrinaire way that intellectuals, especially French intellectuals, who were also, by the way, Catholic, there is a certain tendency towards dogmatism. But these folks were decidedly hostile towards the established authorities of the Ancien Regime, especially the church and especially the king. These were the folks that were, dramatically, critical of those kind of dogmatic bases of authority that they viewed as obstacles to the advance of reason. The guy pictured on our slide is Antoine Louis Claude Destutt, Comte de Tracy, who was basically one of the leading figures of the Institut de France. And he initially deployed the word ideology to refer to the philosophy of the mind. And again, de Tracy was one of these very architectonic thinkers who believed you could build this architecture of science, of belief, and that would inevitably lead to advances in knowledge. I think the evolution of ideology over time kind of demonstrates that was a bit naive. There are 3 important features of this early manifestation of ideology as a body of knowledge. And again, it was first the belief in the explicit linkage between logic, psychology, and politics, which could be set down in a table of simple propositions and backed up with more extensive observations. 2, the assumption that intellectuals discover the truth and that well-advised political authorities implement policies to match. That kind of, again, reflected the sense in which the political rulers would be aligned with these philosophical figures. And 3rd, the claim that logic, psychology, and politics, as linked, are compatible with science and history, properly understood. So Napoleon, again, at that point in 1795, he's a very young guy. He's 28 years old. He was accomplished on the battlefield, was still kind of unsure of his political footing, and was searching for potential bases of political support outside the French military. Okay, so why did Napoleon cultivate the philosophes? Because he already had those kinds of ambitions. Okay. Why did the philosophes support Napoleon's coup d'etat in 1799? Well, because they bought the idea that Napoleon could be their philosopher king, right, following Plato's ideas, that only truly just society would be a society where someone had sufficient power and sufficient knowledge to govern. So the question arises, were the philosophes naive in assuming that Napoleon would be amenable to their advice? And the answer is yes, they were. So Napoleon broke with the philosophes in 1812, largely because by then he was well established in his rule of France as a monarch, and he found their musings to be, to be annoying. So he came up with a new word, ideologues. He basically denounced the philosophes as ideologues, which is an inversion of what the philosophes thought was the proper relationship between intellectuals and rulers. Napoleon subsequently dismissed the works of the Institut de France as ideology, that's sinister metaphysics. So Napoleon found that intellectuals could be useful scapegoats. Make of that what you will. Do you see that in the world today? I think we do. So the next figure that uses the term ideology is Karl Marx. In 1844, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were in the midst of a struggle for the soul of European socialism. Of course, the Communist Manifesto would be written within a 3-year period of this. Again, they were contending with anarchists on the left and moderate trade unionists on the right. The German ideology was a set of manuscripts written in 1848 amid those conflicts within German socialism. Marx appropriated the term ideology to suggest a kind of gaslighting, which the elimination of class divisions with the revolution of the proletariat would dispense. Okay, they would get rid of this idea of ideology. So Marx is clearly using this idea of ideology as a term of abuse. Marx incorporated ideology and ideologists within his account of history as the product of class-divided societies. He had a famous quote that really captures this. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. In other words, the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. So ideology in his usage are a body of ideas that give apparent validity and legitimacy and assumed authority to claims that the bourgeoisie might make in order to justify what they are doing. Marx assumed that ideologies would be primarily reactionary, conservative, reformist, or revolutionary, depending on the way that material interests were pursued by individuals. And he was basically making a kind of scientific claim, right? But he wasn't really basing it on any kind of clear logic or assumptions of moral psychology. Ultimately, Marx would die, I think in the 1860s, and Engels would live on for another, I think, 14 years. And he kind of becomes the primary defender, apologist of Marxism, but also its leading sort of interpreter as well. And Engels kind of transmogrifies Marxism itself into an ideology. So Engels was in many ways a better writer than Marx. He had a career as a bit of a writer of sorts. But he was a less rigorous thinker. He was probably a less talented philosopher. When Marx died in 1883, Engels asserted for himself the role of primary defender and interpreter of Marxism as an edifice of thought, which many people believed was a task beyond his intellectual capabilities. So Engels basically attempts to defend Marx's work as itself scientific. Okay, he is much more, again, deterministic in his views, and Marx had plenty of determinism in his own accounts of history. Marx's followers attempted to account for the obvious inconsistencies between Marx's consistently pejorative use of the term ideology, with Engels and other followers approving usage of the term as a comprehensive system that served the interests of the working class. So again, Engels is basically saying that it is an ideology, but that it's a scientific ideology. It is the truth. It is the way, right? Marx would never really have used the framing that way. He basically used ideology as a way of insulting people. Vladimir Lenin followed Engels in essentially arguing for a kind of socialist ideology. So he identified, again, ideologies as weapons of sorts by the classes. And so you have, on the one hand, the bourgeoisie ideology that is designed to maintain the status quo. And then you have, kind of cloaked within the working class, what he called trade union consciousness, which he again viewed, this was workers basically accepting bourgeois ideas. So for Lenin, genuine socialist ideology was a tool that a socialist party could use for awakening workers to the irreconcilable antagonism of their interests to the whole of modern political and social life. So for Lenin, kind of what we might call proletarian ideology is deployed by, the socialists. By that time, it was the Bolsheviks, to pierce the veil of illusions that bourgeois ideology, puts before workers' eyes. And within the confines of Lenin's political philosophy, scientific was equated with serving working class interests, while anything hostile in Lenin's judgment to the interests of the proletariat was to be denounced as trade union consciousness. Now, another important way of looking at ideology was advanced by a Hungarian sociologist by the name of Karl Mannheim, as a 20th century sociologist. He fled from Hungary in the 1920s and then fled from the Nazis in the 1930s for Britain. And he basically, again, how did Mannheim view ideology? He had this way of looking at it between the highly particularistic ideologies of any particular period versus what he called a total ideology, which characterized, and really transcended any particular national border. And so for Mannheim, a particular ideology were the set of opinions of a group of people that characterize a particular culture, whereas a total ideology was the ideology of an age or historico-social group, the structure of mind of this epoch or this group. And in this instance, he's basically saying that capitalism is sort of a total ideology, right? So ideology is alternatively, as it has evolved, from De Tracy, which is viewed it as a general grammar and logic, as a science about whose methods, truth, and timelessness there is no doubt, to Napoleon, who denounced it as a sinister metaphysics, to Marx as elitist axe grinding, to Engels as the reincarnation of De Tracy's scientific confidence but on a narrow class-based basis, to Lenin's proletarian ideology as again scientific and all else is rubbish. So what does Carver make of this? Ideology thus has been moved from denoting the elements of a comprehensive, programmatic politics to functioning as an element of a supremely doubtful taxonomy. Again, what is he saying? He's saying that it's become a cudgel. It has both negative and positive connotations, but it tends to capture kind of coherent sets of thought. People have a tendency to identify other people with whom they largely agree and orient themselves accordingly. So for Carver, again, ideology in sum is not a concept that denotes some particular phenomenon in the world. It is not a template against which something is or is not an ideology. Rather, it is an agenda of things to discuss, questions to ask, hypotheses to make. Political theory is not an exercise in grave digging so that inconvenient problems can disappear. Instead, it provides a wealth of critical perspectives, if only we are prepared to use it. And again, part of this, we oftentimes talk about the idea of ideas. We've vanquished fascism, and people talked about that for years. Everybody's like, well, is fascism even worth talking about? All the fascists are dead. No, they're not. Ideas don't die. Ideas tend to persist. This is one of the problems that is really dogging the situation with Israel's war in Gaza. Israel was attacked on October 7th, a couple of years ago. They had every right to attack and to do what they could do to prevent Hamas from ever doing what they did again. However, the problem for the regime is that they have set for themselves the military task of eradicating Hamas. You can't eradicate a group of people within a larger group of people without eradicating the people itself. The problem for Israel, the problem for Palestinians, is the Palestinians don't like. I think many Palestinians are deeply hostile to Hamas. Would probably love to have been able to vote them out, but those guys had the guns. And the simple problem is, in seeking to eradicate Hamas, Israel is increasingly engaging in ethnic cleansing. They are killing well beyond what I think the limitations of war would permit. They have killed far more people. They've killed far more women and children than they have members of Hamas. It's an incredibly dense area, in no small part because Gaza and the West Bank are already overpopulated by people who had been expelled from Israel proper in 1948. And so you can't kill the ideology that informs Hamas. In fact, the more you kill people, the more likely it is that you are going to contribute to the further radicalization of Palestinians. This is not really a problem that can be resolved through force of arms, because it is, in essence, ideological in nature. Ideas don't die. They lay dormant for a while. They may be discredited for a period of time. But oftentimes within a generation or two or three, those ideas come back into vogue. They come back and they find themselves cloaked in a kind of legitimacy again. So this is a challenge that we confront with ideology. Was there a way where Israel could have controlled Hamas, gotten rid of Hamas somehow, without destroying most of the standing structures in Gaza? I don't know. It's hard to say. I don't think that the use of snipers. I mean, how many reports are there from American doctors who have gone over there and reported, having children with sniper wounds and head wounds from snipers? This is part of the problem that that ideology creates. Ideology fosters division. Division oftentimes can metastasize into hate. You have to find ways of living together for a period. And I don't see a good end to that particular conflict, again, because there is no side, neither side is prepared to give up. Let's move on to the next topic that we're going to deal with. This is the ideological brain. There is a Cambridge University neuroscientist. She explores the possibility that brain physiology and biology decisively influence how human beings perceive and share information. The neuroscientist, her name is Lior Zemigrod. This year, she wrote a book called The Ideological Brain from Henry Holt, and that is, again, the radical science of flexible thinking. So what is the difference between someone who is, who may be a partisan but is not an ideologue? What separates most people from those folks that we would characterize as ideologues? Zemigrod characterizes ideology as a narrative that proposes a rigidly prescriptive, view of how people should perceive and act in the world. So she argues that Zemigrod argues that ideologies numb our direct experience of the world, that it causes us to think in formulaic ways. Quotation, they narrow our capacity to adapt to the world, to understand evidence, to distinguish between credible evidence and not credible evidence. And so again, in her view, ideologies are rarely, if ever, good. Now, I would make an argument for her that ideologies may not be good, but they probably are inevitable in some sense. And the question, again, like I said at the end of my last presentation, the problem with ideologies is that we take them too seriously. Like anything, an ideology is a tool, and it works best when you use the right tool for the right job. Okay. So oftentimes the problem is that human beings, we don't come into this world as a tabula rasa, and by the time we become adults, many of us our kind of brains run in deep channels. So people believe what they want to believe. They believe the narrative that their system of facts, that whatever it is that their brain is giving them, we have faith in that. She cites Elise Frankel-Brunswick, interviews of children in the 1940s, testing the levels of prejudice and authoritarian tendency of children. Children who scored highly on prejudice scales had highly selective recall of key events. Additionally, such children displayed a tendency to stray from the story and incorporate fictions that confirm their pre-existing biases. So, again, that kind of, we're seeing this to some extent, happening around us. When you look, for example, at, Donald Trump recently said on social media, he wants to review museums and how museums are presenting, America and the world. He thinks museums are spending too much time on presentations about slavery. Well, slavery did happen, and and pretending it didn't doesn't make it so. But it can, again, part of the problem here is that we tend to suppress things that we don't want to believe. On one show, on CNN show a couple of days ago, a fitness influencer, I can't remember her name, it's probably best if I don't mention it, effectively offered a kind of apology for slavery, saying that only 2% of white people owned slaves in America, during that period. Well, that really ignores the extent to which whites largely agreed that blacks were not human and did not have rights that any white person was required to respect. Whether they owned slaves or not, they participated in a system where people were systematically subjugated for the benefit of a small number of people. And again, rethinking that, reimagining that, imagining that slavery. There was in the Florida, they were redoing the teaching standards for the public schools, and they were trying to make the argument within the learning standards that slaves in some ways benefited from slavery. They learned to trade or whatever it was, which to me is a bizarre transmogrification of how we should be thinking about slavery. So again, Zemegrad's argument is that people who have a certain kind of neuroprocessing, they don't process information well. When you do tests with visual and linguistic puzzles, when the rules change, as part of an experience, as part of an experiment, ideologically rigid thinkers their evidence emerges that they're resistant to change. They persist in applying the old rule. People who are less reliant on ideology, and again, I'm wondering how they operationalize this. I would like to see that, because it strikes me that might be a tough one to actually, get right. So, but basically, they argue that people that are less reliant on ideology tend to be more adaptable and open to processing new information. In other words, they're quicker to identify what has changed, right? What has changed? Well, the rules, right? The experimenter, without telling us, has changed the rules. So what are we supposed to do? Well, we can keep applying the same thing over and over again, or we can try to figure out how to solve the problem. This is something that educators talk a lot about, and that is this idea of developing critical thinking skills, developing ways of looking at your environment and understanding that when things change, you have to evolve with them. And you have to, again, if you want to solve a problem, you have to figure out ways of alternative ways of dealing with these issues. The role of the amygdala, according to Zemegrad, is significant, right? And what is the amygdala? It is a part of the brain that is responsible for processing emotions. So there are genetic markers that affect how dopamine is distributed, and dopamine is a neurotransmitter that regulates movement, motivations, and rewards. And in a very important sense, dopamine distribution determines what gives a person pleasure or satisfaction. So if you derive a great deal of pleasure out of reading a book versus watching a movie, it's going to have a lot to do with the dopamine and how it's distributed in your body. Research suggests that people with high levels of dopamine in the striatum tend to have more rigid thought processes. And again, the striatum is the part of the midbrain that controls rapid instincts. And large amounts of dopamine affect emotional processing and habit formation. So again, people who are rigid thinkers, it may be that there is something in their brain chemistry that causes them to think that way. So it creates a kind of a chicken and egg problem. So, is a person's receptivity to ideology a function of brain structure? I think undoubtedly it is, but we can't be sure if it's something that is originating with the brain chemistry, or if the brain chemistry has formed in a way resulting in earlier usage, the way the brain has worked in your earlier experiences. So it's a nature versus nurture kind of problem. Is this genetically encoded? Does the brain chemistry that you have, is that just simply the result of the X's and Y's that your parents give you? Or is it more complex? Is there an experiential basis for this? You have to tease out those distinctions, and that can be challenging to do. Is brain structure modified by a person's choices and beliefs? This again creates, we talk about this idea in politics of path dependence quite a bit, right? And that is the idea that decisions you make at an earlier point are going to structure and influence the kinds of decisions that are available to you later on, right? So, from a political perspective, for example, Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine first and foremost because he believed he could win an easy victory. He believed that the Ukrainian political leadership would flee the country, and that they would just take control, install a dictator or whoever that was more amenable to their governance, and that would just, that would be it. The problem was Ukraine has a long experience with being governed, being ruled by Russia, and its political leadership showed a lot more courage than most political elites, generally are going to show. And they fought back. And in fact, because there had been a low-grade civil war in the eastern provinces for more than a decade, Ukraine's military performed a heck of a lot better than a lot of people thought they would. Now, what do I mean, in terms of path dependence? Well, Putin, having invaded Ukraine, what could he do, right? They thought, again, quick and easy victory. Within a month or two, it was clear that their early moves to try and basically just seize Kiev had failed, and that now the war was going to look like a lot like World War I trench warfare with drones, right? That was probably not the war that he wanted, right? But here is Putin's problem, and here is again how path dependence works. He couldn't just leave, right? If he simply withdrew Russian forces, if he said, yeah, we got what we wanted, we're out, his own political structure likely would collapse. Because his political structure is authoritarian in nature, it's fragile. People around Putin are invested in him, but not everyone in Russian society is. And so what are his options? He can continue to fight this really ugly slog of a war, which, again, it's a choice that's not really a great choice. Putin at this point doesn't have a lot of great choices, but he thinks he can get, Donetsk. He thinks he can get that western region and pry it away, and that, maybe he'll stop there for a while. They'll declare a ceasefire. He'll give Trump that sop at some point, maybe. And then he'll just invade again in a couple of years. That's why Russia is dead set against any kinds of, security guarantees for Ukraine. So when you think through these issues, again, the decisions you make at one point are going to affect the options that are available to you down the line. This is one reason why I think Donald Trump's decision to have a summit with Putin was really imprudent, right? Because first and foremost, he said at the start, before he ever went to the summit, I want a ceasefire, right? Well, then, all of a sudden, he goes and he actually meets with Trump. He has no real set agenda for what he wants to do. Russian and U.S. diplomatic people hadn't been talking about a summit at all. It was a snap summit. And, Trump walked into there not really knowing what he wanted. And Putin knew exactly what he wanted, and he knew exactly who he was dealing with in Donald Trump. What does anyone listening to this think that Putin said to Trump at that summit? What do you think? I think he said, I want what I want. I want Ukraine. I'm not going to stop until I get Ukraine. Here are my conditions for a ceasefire. Ukraine has to withdraw out of all of those provinces that they're currently in combat operations. They have to acknowledge the loss of all those eastern territories. Their military has to disarm. There could be no foreign troops in Ukraine other than, there are no European troops, no security guarantees, or if there are, Chinese troops. Because Putin is allied with Xi Jinping. The worst thing you can do in a summit is to negotiate with yourself. And Trump didn't have any clear ideas. That's why nothing came out of it. There's been no reporting on any sort of specific, here's what we agreed on, kinds of things. That's, again, you don't do snap summits for that reason. Because here's something that Trump probably doesn't appreciate. Summits are supposed to be culminations of long periods of negotiation. And presidents own whatever summit, whatever comes out of that summit. So if Trump does a summit with Putin and nothing comes of it, and the war continues, and people continue to die, and the war continues on, Trump looks like he got nothing out of it, which he didn't. Maybe he'll learn from this. I don't know. I don't think so. I think he fundamentally views summits as a photo op, which again is a catastrophic misunderstanding of a basic tool of diplomacy. So Zemograd suggests we can shift in terms of our flexibility. It's obviously harder for people who have genetic or biological vulnerabilities toward rigid thinking. But that doesn't mean that it's predetermined or impossible to change. In other words, what she's saying is that we do have free will. But first and foremost, we have to acknowledge, you have to get the ideologue to acknowledge that they're an ideologue. How easy is that to do? How many of you know someone that is very, very deeply rooted in their approach to life, who are absolutely unaware of their own thought processes? Most people don't want to think too deeply about what it is that they don't examine their own beliefs. In fact, for many people, that is the very proposition that they could examine their basic assumptions, that's offensive. My beliefs are my beliefs. They are articles of faith. Many people who are religious, I've been in a room with Senator James Lankford, and he has basically said, my entire worldview, my approach to politics is informed by my Christianity. Well, if you are a Christian and you are a Christian politician, by the very logic of what you have just said, your belief system is not subject to revision. You are effectively, set in your viewpoint, and whatever it is that your religion suggests to you. Now, one of the things about religion is that it is incredible, like ideology, it is incredibly malleable. And oftentimes, religious perspectives evolve in response to political events in the world. In 1973, the Southern Baptist Church was not particularly upset by the Roe versus Wade decision. They became upset, and they adopted the Catholic Church's pro-life perspective on abortion in the later 1970s, in 1977, when the Carter administration proposed stripping the tax-exempt status from a South Carolina religious school, Bob Jones University, because they refused to accept black students. So what does that tell you? I mean, I oftentimes throw these things out, make of it what you will. It's important to keep in mind that ideology informs us, and it can misinform us. If we're not constantly on our toes and thinking about, how we view the world, thinking about what our ideological convictions are suggesting. And again, people who can't say, well, this is one issue area on which my ideology is not doing me very good. Those are flexible thinkers. Those are people who are capable of acknowledging that their worldview is not always going to be the correct one. And people who can do that are people who are in a position to revise, some basic stuff. The Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was challenged by a Republican colleague, accused him of changing his views. And he said, well, I got new information. When I get new information, I change my views. What do you do? Right? I think we should all approach politics and our lives generally as if we don't have all the data, right? We need to get to a place where we have a better understanding of things before we, jump to conclusions. We need to put ourselves in a position where, we have enough information to make judgments. So one of the things, when we see what's going on in the world, don't worry so much about what you're, seeing on television. Okay, television is not the best transmitter of reality, or even social media, especially social media. I mean, notwithstanding all the misinformation out there, there is also the reality that very frequently we are responding to what I would characterize as sort of a modern manifestation of chivalry, of the rumors that would fly through villages in medieval times. You have to recognize that sometimes people are just throwing stuff out there. In fact, I would make the argument that we should be looking more to courtrooms and court decisions as saying, here's how political reality has changed, rather than whatever is on TV on a given night. So this is sort of the baseline. This is our first kind of foray into understanding the role of ideology, the challenges that ideology presents to our having a good, informed understanding of the world. When we come back next presentation, we're going to start talking about democracy. What does democracy mean? Democracy, like freedom, is another one of those words that we characterize as essentially contested. It's one of those words that there is no clear standard for determining what is what, right? I can say that I believe democracy means that people have the right to speak out, that people have the right to clearly, that there are free and fair elections, a variety of things of that nature. But Vladimir Putin believes he's a supporter of democracy too. How does that happen? How does somebody like that get to a point where they think they're articulating something that is meaningfully democratic? And again, it reflects this notion that democracy means different things to different people. For the ancient Greeks, democracy was a face-to-face, in-your-face kind of process. That's not possible today. We can't get everybody in the same room to deliberate. Even the Iowa caucuses demonstrate there's simply too many people in Iowa to have a genuine democracy. Okay? So we're going to look at democracy and how democracy interacts with various ideologies and how that leads to very different conceptions of democracy. And then we're also going to look at some ideologies over time that absolutely reject ideology, or reject democracy as an ideal to which they aspire. I'll see you next time.